Connecticut's nickname is the Constitution State. Not because of this constitution, but because of this one, the Fundamental Orders of 1639. Depending on how you count, this was the first constitution ever written, and it was used for a while to govern the Connecticut colony. But the nickname of the Constitution State wouldn't have made much sense to Americans in the 1780s. After declaring independence, Connecticut hadn't written a new state constitution to outline how their government would function without the British monarchy and Parliament. The Constitution State decided that constitutions are actually kinda lame. They would just continue to use their colonial charter. So despite being a brand new independent state, the governing document of Connecticut began like this.
Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, etc., to whom all these presents shall come, greeting.
Charles II, by the way, hadn't been king for like 100 years at this point. Naturally, as a century-old royalist document, the colonial charter was very top-down and not democratic at all, even by 18th century standards. It was still a republic, but there were a bunch of mechanisms built into the charter that allowed a handful of the wealthiest citizens to dominate the politics of the state. This gave the state a reputation for being very conservative and aristocratic. Future President John Adams wrote of the state, "Connecticut has always been governed by an aristocracy. Half a dozen, or at most a dozen families have controlled that country when a colony, as well as since it has been a state." That stereotype started to be challenged by a wave of populism that swept New England in the 1780s. In Massachusetts, the populists would eventually take up arms in an insurrection known as Shays' Rebellion. In Connecticut, it took the form of a peaceful meeting of reformers in Middletown, where democratizing reforms to the charter were proposed. The populists were hostile to giving the federal government new powers, especially the power to tax imports and keep a standing army. In the fall elections after the Middletown Convention, a staggering 60% of the Connecticut legislature lost their seats to new populist challengers. Thanks to the aristocratic nature of the Connecticut Charter, the Executive Council was largely insulated from this populist wave. Still, the legislature dragged the Conservative Council along with their reforms, which largely strengthened the agrarian voters of the state, while passing other measures that eased taxes on small farmers that had fought in the War for Independence. You can see here why the violence of Shays' Rebellion didn't spill over into Connecticut. While the Massachusetts legislature had ignored the farmers for the better part of a decade, Connecticut had voted sympathetic politicians into power that would enact policies on their behalf. So the populists were firmly in control of the legislature, and it seemed like they weren't huge fans of giving new powers to the federal government. But it wasn't that simple. Even the populists in Connecticut knew that they would benefit from some parts of the Constitution. During the war, Connecticut had remained largely untouched by the fighting, so their farms and small manufactories had become reliable sources of wartime materials for the other states. While the other states bore the brunt of the fighting, Connecticut enjoyed a nice economic boom. Now after the war, Connecticut's neighbors, by which I mostly mean New York, started to outpace the state in terms of production. And to add insult to injury, they had raised tariffs on goods made or grown in Connecticut. Tariffs meant that Connecticut didn't have access to their neighbors' markets, meaning a drop-off in demand, leading prices to fall, leading to less profits for farmers. So even though the populists tended to be hesitant when it came to the federal government, they knew that the Constitution wouldn't be all that bad for them, since states within the new government would give up the power to slap tariffs on their neighbors. Connecticut's delegation to the Federal Convention had also played a huge part in the structure of the government. The Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, had guaranteed that the small states would retain the right to an equal number of senators. So the populists and the aristocrats in the state government called an election for delegates to a state ratifying convention. Each town was guaranteed as many delegates to the convention as they had seats in the legislature, which was a lot compared to the previous conventions. All told, 175 people would be attending the convention. The result of the elections seemed promising for the Federalists, although in some inland areas, populist critics of the Constitution had guaranteed seats for themselves. The convention met in Hartford on schedule on January 3rd. They gathered in the State House, where they voted for an open-door convention so a crowd could gather in the gallery. They decided to debate the Constitution article by article, but agreed not to take any vote unless it was to give a final yes or no to the Constitution. This would stop the opposition from proposing amendments. Remember, Federalists were terrified of people proposing amendments to the Constitution, since they were convinced that this would lead to an endless debate that would lead to the eventual death of the new government. Most of the accounts of the convention were written by the local papers, so they were heavily biased toward the Federalists. But even accounts that sympathized with the opposition acknowledged that critics of the Constitution were severely outclassed by the Federalist speakers. All 3 delegates from the Federal Convention argued for the Constitution, alongside the governor, lieutenant governor, and several state assemblymen and judges. The opposition simply didn't have any champions like Findlay, Whitehill, and Smiley had been in Pennsylvania. Whenever the opposition did speak, the Federalist crowd in the gallery would shuffle their feet, spit, and talk over the delegates. As the debates went on, the opposition spoke less and less and less. By and large, these debates consisted of economic arguments for the Constitution while explaining away concerns about the new powers of Congress. Connecticut would save up to £50,000 a year in import duties to just New York alone. That was a hard deal to turn down. On the 9th, the question of ratification was finally put to a vote. Connecticut ratified the Constitution by a vote of 128 to 40. Connecticut became the 5th state to ratify the Constitution. As a fun bit of foreshadowing, let's take a look at the map of everyone who voted against ratification. Each one of these markers represents one delegate from a town that voted no. Aside from New Haven County, most of this opposition was in the northern part of the state, just a stone's throw away from Shays Country. Their counterparts across the border in Massachusetts had just months before been in open rebellion resisting the coastal elite. This region, along with some other factors, was making Massachusetts the first state where the Federalists would not have the upper hand. Massachusetts was up next.